Hello and welcome to the tonight's edition of Lessons of Vietnam. Uh, we are going to be continuing on from the first part we did about talking about John McCain, his life as a POW and so forth. We are going to be going over a good part of it. We got the second slide here as the Veterans Crisis Line right now because of the quarantine and so forth that we're talking about. A lot of veterans are having a hard time. Talked to some yesterday. The quarantine is starting to work on them a little bit. Some of them are afraid to go out because of health things. So if you're out there and you've got some health situations and been locked up at home or so forth, and you need somebody to talk to, call the Veterans Crisis Line. They got veterans there, welcome to answer your phone and so forth. We're going to go right on into, I am your host, Bill Dixon of the Lessons of Vietnam. And okay, that is our starting, help those who remember and teach those who don't. The Lessons of Vietnam school curriculum. It was founded by Bob Matthews and North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated. It was put together to help dispel the many myths of Americans involved in the Vietnam War. This online show is a continuation of that effort. Bob and I started this show with the assistance of Amnon Nissan's broadcasting facilities, no salaries or budget, just a desire for the truth to be told. Bob is retired and moved back home out of state, leaving Amnon and myself to continue this mission. Now, the mission is to get the word out there, the real story and so forth, and sometimes it's hard to find the truth. All this being said, the show is based on trying to get the truths, the lessons of the Vietnam show. We strive to always give you the real story and invite any corrections by our audience. So if there's anything that you see during the show that you don't think is correct, please reach out and let us know. My name again is Bill Dixon. I am the host, researcher. I am responsible for all of it. So if you want to get mad, I guess you don't get mad with Amnon because he just pushes the buttons and keeps me going, which is a tough job in itself. But my email is Dixon, Dixon, Bill80 at yahoo.com. That way you can get in touch with me and tell me that you liked the show or didn't like the show or what I need to do to correct it. And I will do everything I can to correct it so that we have it right. Moving right along, Emma, can we go back to that slide? There you go. We are talking about an article. And now each one of these articles are by someone else. This one happens to buy for CBS News. And Senator John McCain was tortured and held captive for 5.5 years as a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War, an experience that shaped the rest of his life. In Hanoi, McCain is etched into the city's history with a memorial at the lake where his plane crashed, at the prison, now a museum, where he was held captive. Now, right off to start with, we're going to be talking about the people who like John McCain and say good things about him and so forth. Then we're going to be getting on a little bit later in the show from his personal experience of what he wrote about it. And then we're going to get into people who didn't like him. And basically what will come down to, I don't know, one way or the other. I'm going to put all the information out there that's available, and I want you to decide whether he was a hero or he was a collaborator. I'm going to give you the information. You decide. I don't think there's anything that's one way all. There's a little bit of gray in everything, but I'm going to let you decide. McCain's plane, this is what this young lady had to say on CBS News. McCain's plane was shot down during a bombing run over North Vietnam in 1967. And he parachuted into the lake in what is now a busy part of Hanoi. Already badly injured, he was beaten and taken to a nearby prison called Wallow, which U.S. POWs nicknamed Hanoi Hilton. I'm certain most of you have heard about that. He was refused medical treatment and beaten with the bayonet. Actually, he was beaten and stuck in the groin with the bayonet. While holding him as a prisoner of war, the North Vietnamese tried to exploit the fact that his father was a prominent admiral at the time. They offered McCain an early release, but he refused, adhering to the military code of first in, first out. You can see the top left picture there. That is the Hanoi prison, the way it was, Waloe prison, the way it was when he was there. Bottom right-hand corner, you can see the entrance there to it is now. If you look behind, you can carefully see a lot of it's become a condominium. It's a nice tour to go through. About the only thing that mentions about Americans in there is John McCain. The other picture, we're showing John McCain's flight suit. You see the bottom left-hand corner, which is on display there. Like I said, it said to start with, the North Vietnamese really seemed to like John. McCain was finally freed after 5.5 years, 2 of which he spent in solitary confinement. He limped off the plane that returned him to the United States, gripping a handrail and with hair that had turned white, according to New York Times report from 1973 of his release. The injuries he sustained would affect his mobility for the rest of his life. At Trubac Lake, which is situated in the middle of modern-day Hanoi, there is a memorial that bears John McCain's name. He told C-SPAN in 1992 he never understood why the monument is there. Why they erected it and the significance that he has to them, I have never quite figured out, he laughed. But that's the monument to John McCain that's there at the lake. I've seen it. His name is spelled wrong, but it is there at the lake commemorating his crash into the lake. Okay. Mr. McCain, then a Navy lieutenant commander, was by all accounts what the American prisoners call a tough resistor. Now this, remember, is by the young lady who's giving the report for CBS. He was nicknamed Crip because of the severity of the injuries he sustained: a shoulder, both arms, and his knee broken, with a bayonet wound near the groin. When his fighter plane was shot down in October 1967, military rules only allowed POWs to go home in the order of their capture. But some senior officials said his medical condition justified accepting an offer of release from the North Vietnamese. Mr. McCain, the son of a prominent admiral, did not want to be part of North Vietnamese propaganda, so he chose to endure years of torture instead. At times, Mr. McCain seemed to court punishment, noisily cussing out his captors while giving thumbs-up signs to his fellow prisoners. No matter what he did, he always played to the bleachers, Robert Corey, a military historian, wrote in a book about the camps. Okay? All the prisoners acknowledged that everyone had a breaking point. Mr. McCain came 10 months after he arrived. With his father taking command of the Pacific Fleet, the North Vietnamese were determined to coerce the son into denouncing the war. For 4 days, they had him tied with ropes, beat him every few hours, or re-broke his arm, and left him in a pool of his own blood and refuse. Finally, he signed and tape-recorded a war crimes confession. His fellow prisoners say his capitulation only redoubled his determination to provoke his captors. Acts of defiance felt so good that I felt that more than compensated for their repercussions. He had aroused, wrote, and then helped me keep at bay the unsettled feelings of guilt and self-doubt, my confession. Okay. Now, this is what he had to say. On the recording of a copy of which the Arizona Republic obtained from the National Archives and Records Administration, Mr. McCain says he is guilty of crimes against the Vietnamese country and people and compliments his medical treatment. The doctors were very good and they knew a great deal about the practice of medicine, McCain says on the tape. I remained in the hospital for some time and regained much of my health and strength since I arrived in the camp of detention. I have received humane and lenient treatment. I received this kind of treatment and food even though I came here as an aggressor and the people who I injured have much difficulty in their living standards. I wish to express my deep gratitude for my kind treatment, and I will never forget this kindness extended to me. That was a recording he made. It appears that the North Vietnamese used McCain's voice in Radio Hanoi, propaganda broadcast transmitted into South Vietnam too. A UPI United Press International news story with Saigon Dateline, published in June 6, 1969, in the newspaper Stars and Stripes, carried the headline, "Tape has McCain's son praising red doctors." Remember that McCain, the day he was captured, that basically his father was put in charge of all the services in Southeast Asia. It was part of a series of broadcasts that UPI speculated were a response to the U.S. Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, who had been making an issue of POW conditions. 3 of McCain's fellow POWs, Everett Alvarez, Orson Swindle, and Jerry Coffey, provided a joint statement to the Republic calling the record confessions old news, praising McCain's heroism and emphasizing that any feeling of regret that may continue to haunt him are not justified. Okay? Like many of us, John was subjected to torture and coercion, coerced into making false confessions. They said in a written statement, "We all tried, as John did, to resist the best of our physical and mental abilities to abuse the abuse the enemy inflicted on us. We all have our limits, and many of us reach ours in Hanoi." While he was often expressed remorse, his regret is uncalled for. He fought our captors as hard as any of us. He did all that he could expected of him. The first one you see there is Alvarez. Most people have thought he was the longest held POW. When they were getting ready to come home, Floyd Thompson came in and discovered that Alvarez was the second longest because Thompson was the longest. Then you see Orson Swindell and Jerry Coffey. Okay, next slide. Others responded differently. Initially unable to feed or clean himself, McCain was nursed back to health by his cellmate, Major Norris Overley of the Air Force. Mr. McCain has often credited Mr. Overley with saving his life, calling him a very fine man. Returning from an interrogation in February 1968, however, Mr. Overley told his cellmates he was going home. He said, as he later testified to Congress, that he had given his captors nothing and could not explain the decision. Mr. McCain said in his email message that he had never been angry with Mr. Overley. In his memoir, he recalls only a fear his friend was making a mistake. "I couldn't stand in judgment of him," he wrote. Mr. McCain said that, okay? But his fellow prisoners say he felt betrayed. After a goodbye ceremony staged for North Vietnamese cameras, Mr. McCain arrived on a stretcher. He and the others began referring to the departures as the Think Release program in the Slimies. By the end of 1972, a dozen of the roughly 400 American prisoners of war in the North had accepted offers to be freed. Only one with the permission of the senior American officers. All were required at the very least to sign letters requesting amnesty and thanking the North Vietnamese. Some went further. As early as 1969, Mr. McCain began hearing 3 American officers denouncing the war over camp loudspeakers. The first 2, Robert Schweitzer, Edison Miller, became known as the Bob and Ed Show. Walter Eugene Wilbert soon joined. Okay? They were followed by as many as a dozen others, enlisted infantrymen captured in South Vietnam early in the war and later brought to the northern prisoners. They had not received the same training and survival strategies and the code of conduct as the pilots who made up the rest of the prisons in the North. The cooperators, called themselves the Peace Committee and enjoyed treats from their captors, including beer, ice cream, Vietnamese dinners, and front row seats at local circuses. They lived in fear of retribution from the tough resistors. Mr. Miller and Mr. Wilbur, the officers, said in an interview they had considered it pointless to resist after they had surrendered. "I think our duty as senior officers is to get these men home as healthy emotionally and physically as we can. And I don't intend to play politics," Mr. Miller, a Marine lieutenant colonel, said he told the others. Okay. Some members of the peace committee said that watching the destruction of the Vietnamese villages had turned them against the war, arguing that pilots did not see the carnage. Others said they were beaten down. We said what we had to say to get through. Michael Branch, one of the enlisted men, said in an interview, Mr. McCain was enraged as any of the tough resistors by what they considered the treason of the two officers and enlisted men. His friends said he thought this was terrible, terrible, terrible. They should all be shot, said John Dramasi, a fellow prisoner. In his memoirs, Mr. McCain addressed only briefly what he called the camp rats. During a stint in solitary confinement, he had caught a glimpse of two other American officers acting friendly with their guards and enjoying delicacies like eggs and bananas. Mr. McCain, his co-author, wrote, okay, assuming that contact with a fellow American would restore their nerve, Mr. McCain called out, hey guys, my name is McCain. Who are you? They called the guards who beat him again. I guess that was referring to McCain they were beating. These two were Mr. Miller and Mr. Wilbur. They denied the exchange took place, but in his email message, McCain said, I would have been astonished if they admitted it. He cast a cold eye on the public sympathy for prisoners like himself. 2.5 million Americans, fighting men, served in the Vietnam conflict, and more than 46,000 sacrificed their lives, Mr. McCain wrote. Yet in the latter stages of that war, millions of people were more actively concerned about the plight of 565 POWs in Hanoi than any bigger issues of the war. American elected officials, Mr. McCain argued, had fostered a myopic focus on the prisoners by forsaking the goal of an unconditional surrender in favor of a negotiated peace, enabling the North Vietnamese to turn over their hostages into a bargaining chip. Many congressional resolutions favorable to the enemy were based solely on the guaranteed return of Americans from the North Vietnam, he wrote. Some of my fellow prisoners sang a different tune, but they were a very small minority, he added. I asked myself if they should be prosecuted, and I don't find that easy to answer. It might destroy the very fine image that great majority of us have brought back from the hellhole. You can see there the POW standing in line. Here in his own words, based on almost total recall, is Commander McCain's narrative of 5.5 years in the hands of North Vietnamese. Now this is right out of his book, his statements. The date was October 26, 1967. I was on my 23rd mission, flying right over the heart of Hanoi in a dive at about 4,500 feet when a Russian missile the size of a telephone pole came up. The sky was full of them and blew the right wing off my Skyhawk dive bomber. It went into an inverted, almost straight down spin. I pulled the ejection handle and was knocked unconscious by the force of the ejection. The airspeed was about 500 knots. I didn't realize it at the moment, but I had broken my right leg around the knee, my right arm in 3 places, and my left arm. I regained consciousness just before I landed by parachute in the lake right in the corner of Hanoi, one they called the Western Lake. Now remember, this is McCain talking about his time as a POW. My helmet and my oxygen mask had been blown off. I hit the water and sank to the bottom. I think the lake is about 15 feet deep, maybe 20. I kicked off the bottom. I did not feel any pain at the time and was able to rise to the surface. I took a breath of air and started sinking again. Of course, I was wearing 50 pounds at least of equipment and gear. I went down and managed to kick up to the surface once more. I couldn't understand why I couldn't use my right leg or my arm. I was in a dazed condition. I went up to the top again and sank back down. This time, I couldn't get back to the surface. I was wearing an inflatable life preserver type thing that looked like water wings. I reached down with my mouth and got the toggle between my teeth and inflated the preserver and finally floated to the top. Okay. There's a picture of them bringing him up and so forth. Some North Vietnamese swam out and pulled me to the side of the lake and immediately started stripping me, which is their standard procedure. Of course, this being in the center of town, a huge crowd of people gathered, and they were all hollering and screaming and cursing and spitting and kicking at me. When they had most of my clothes off, I felt a twinge at my right knee. I sat up and looked at it. My right foot was resting next to my left knee, just in a 90-degree position. I said, "My God, my leg." That seemed to enrage them. I don't know why. One of them slammed a rifle butt down on my shoulder and smashed it pretty badly. Another stuck a bayonet in my foot. The mob was really getting uptight. Okay, next. About this time, a cat came up and started yelling at the crowd to leave me alone. A woman came over and propped me up and held a cup of tea to my lips, and some photographers took some pictures. This quieted the crowd down quite a bit. Pretty soon, they put me on a stretcher, lifted up onto a truck, and took me to Hanoi's main prison. I was taken into a cell and put on the floor. I was still on the stretcher, dressed only in my skivvies with a blanket over me. For the next 3 or 4 days, I lapsed from consciousness to unconsciousness. During this time, I was taken out to interrogation, which we called a quiz, several times. That's when I was hit with all sorts of war criminal charges. This started on the first day. I refused to give them anything except my name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. They beat me around a little bit. Okay. I was in such bad shape that when they hit me, it would knock me unconscious. They kept saying, "You will not receive any medical treatment until you talk." I didn't believe this. I thought if I just held out, they'd take me to the hospital. I was fed some small amounts of food by the guard and almost allowed to drink some water. Also allowed to drink some water. I was able to hold the water down, but I kept vomiting the food. They wanted a military rather than a political information at this time. Every time they asked me something, I just give my name, rank, and serial number and date of birth. There you see him in the bed. Okay. I think it was on the 4th day that 2 guards came in. Instead of one of them pulled back the blanket to show the other guard my injury. I looked at my knee. It was about the size, shape, and color of a football. I remember that when I was flying instructor, a fellow had ejected from his plane and broke his thigh. He'd gone into shock. The blood had pooled in his leg, and he died, which came as quite a surprise to us, a man dying of a broken leg. To realize that a very similar thing was happening to me. When I saw it, I said to the guard, "Okay, get the officer." An officer came in after a few minutes. It was the man that we came to know very well as the Bug. He was a psychotic torturer, one of the worst fiends that we have to deal with. I said, "Okay, I'll give you military information if you will take me to the hospital." Next. He left and came back with a doctor, a guy they call Zorba, who was completely incompetent. He squatted down, took my pulse. He did not speak English, but he shook his head and jabbered to the Bug. I asked, "Are you going to take me to the hospital?" The Bug replied, "It's too late." I said, "If you take me to the hospital, I'll get well." Zorba took my pulse again and repeated, "It's too late." They got up and left, and I lapsed into unconsciousness. Sometime later, the Bug came rushing into the room shouting, "Your father's an admiral. Now we take you to the hospital." We found out who he was. I tell this story to make this point. There were hardly any amputees among the prisoners who came back because the North Vietnamese just would not give a medical treatment to someone who was badly injured. They weren't going to waste their time. For one thing, in the transition from the kind of life we led in America to the filth and dirt and infections, it would be very difficult for a guy to live anyway. In fact, my treatment in the hospital almost killed me. I woke up a couple times in the next 3 or 4 days. Plasma and blood were being put into me. I came fairly lucid. I was in a room which was not particularly small, about 15 by 15 feet, but it was filthy, dirty, and at a lower level, so that every time it rained, there'd be about a half inch to an inch of water on the floor. I was not washed once while I was in the hospital. I almost never saw a doctor or a nurse. Doctors came in a couple of times to look at me. They spoke French, not English. Next. Okay. For a guard, I was assigned a 16-year-old kid right out of the rice field. His favorite pastime was sit by my bed and read a book that had a picture in it of an old man with a rifle in his hand sitting on the fuselage of an F-105, which had been shot down. He would point to himself and slap me and hit me. He had a lot of fun that way. He fed me because my both arms were broken. He would come in with a cup that had noodles and some gristle in it and fill a spoon and put it in my mouth. The gristle was very hard to chew. I'd get my mouth full after 3 or 4 spoonfuls, and I'd be chewing away on it. I couldn't take any more in my mouth, so he'd just eat the rest of it himself. I was getting about 3 or 4 spoonfuls of food twice a day. It got so that I kind of didn't give a damn, even though I tried as hard as I could to get enough to eat. Okay. After I had been there about 10 days, a gook, which is what we call the North Vietnamese, came in one morning. This man spoke English very well. He asked me how I was, and I said, we have a Frenchman who is here in Hanoi visiting and would like to take a message back to your family. Being a little naive at the time, you get smarter as you go along with these people. I figured this wasn't a bad deal at all. If this guy would come to see me and go back and tell my family that I was alive. I didn't know at the time that my name had been released in a rather big propaganda splash by the North Vietnamese, and they were very, very happy to have captured me. They told a number of my friends when I was captured, we have the Crown Prince, which was somewhat amusing to me. That's a picture of John McCain talking to the Frenchman time. Okay. They told me that the Frenchman would visit me that evening. I was put in a rolling stretcher and taken to a treatment room where they tried to put a cast on my right arm. They had a great difficulty putting the bones together because my arm was broken in 3 places and there were 2 floating bones. I watched the guy try to manipulate it for about an hour and a half, trying to get all the bones lined up. This was without benefits of Novocaine. It was an extremely painful experience, and I passed out a number of times. He finally just gave up and slapped a chest cast on me. This experience was very fatiguing and was the reason why later, when some TV film was taken, it looked like to many people that I had been drugged. When this was over, they took me into the big room with a nice white bed. I thought, boy, things are really looking up. My guard said, now you're going to your new room. Next one. About an hour later, in came a guy called the Cat. I found out later that he was the man who, up until late 1969, was in charge of all the POW camps in Hanoi. He was a rather dapper sort, one of the petty intelligences that ran North Vietnam. He was from the political bureau of the Vietnamese Workers' Party. The first thing he did was show me Colonel John Flynn's identification card. Now General John Flynn, who was our senior officer. He was shot down the same day I was, the Cat said, through an interpreter, as he was not speaking English at the time. The French television man is coming, I said. Well, I don't think I want to be filmed. Whereupon he announced, you need 2 operations, and if you don't talk to him, then we will take your chest cast off and you won't get any operations. He said, you will say that you're grateful to the Vietnamese people and that you're sorry for your crimes. I told him I wouldn't do that. Okay. Finally, the Frenchman came in, a man named Chalet, a communist, as I found out later, with 2 photographers. He asked me about my treatment, and I told him it was satisfactory. The Cat and Chihuahua, another interrogator, were in the background telling me to say that I was grateful for lenient and humane treatment. I refused, and when they pressed me, Calais said, I think what he told me is sufficient. Then he asked if I had a message for my family, and I told him to assure my wife and others in my family that I was getting well and that I loved them. Again, in the background, the cat insisted that I add something about hoping that the war would be soon over so that I could go home. Chalet shut him up very firmly by saying that he was satisfied with my answer. He helped me out of a difficult spot. Okay. Chalet was from Paris. My wife later went to see him, and he gave her a copy of the film, which was shown on CBS television in the United States. As soon as he left, they put me on the cart and took me back to my old dirty room. After that, many visitors came to talk to me. Not all of it was for interrogation. Once a famous North Vietnamese writer, an old man with a Ho Chi Minh beard, came to my room, wanted to know more about Ernest Hemingway. I told him that Ernest Hemingway was violently anti-communist. It gave him something to think about. Others came in to find out about life in the United States. They figured because my father had such high military rank that I was one of the royalty or the governing circle. They have no idea of the way our democracy functions. Next. One of the men who came to see me, whose picture I recognized later, was General Van Nguyen Diep, the hero of Dien Bien Phu. He came to see what I looked like, saying nothing. He is a member of the Minister of Defense and also of North Vietnamese ruling Central Committee. That's a picture of Diep, who was actually said to be running the military part of the war, which was not quite the truth, but that's another story. After about 2 weeks, I was given an operation on my leg, which was filmed. They never did anything for my broken left arm. It healed by itself. They said I needed 2 operations on my leg, but because I had a bad attitude, they wouldn't give me another one. What kind of job they did on my leg, I do not know. Now I'm back, and an orthopedic surgeon is going to cut in and see. He has already told me that they made the incision wrong and cut all the ligaments on one side. Okay. I was in the hospital about 6 weeks, then was taken to Camp Hanoi that was called the Plantation. This was late in December 1967. I was put in a cell with 2 other men, George Day and Norris Overley, both Air Force majors. I was on a stretcher, my leg was stiff, and I was still in a chest cast that I kept for about 2 months. I was down to about 100 pounds from my usual weight of normal weight of 155. I was told later on by Major Day they didn't expect me to live a whole week. I was unable to sit up. I was sleeping about 18 to 20 hours a day. They had to do everything for me. They were allowed to get a bucket of water and wash me off occasionally. They fed me and took fine care of me, and I recovered very rapidly. That is Bud Day's picture. You can see the Medal of Honor around his neck. We moved to another room just after Christmas. In early February 1968, Overley was taken out of our room and released along with Davy Matheny and John Black. They were the first 3 POWs to be released by the North Vietnamese. I understand they had instructions once home to say nothing about treatment so as not to jeopardize those who are still in captivity. And that is the 3 men. The first one is Overley, the next one is David Matheny, and the next one is John Black. That left Day and me alone together. He was rather banged up himself. A bad right arm, which he still has. He had escaped after he had been captured down south and was shot when they had captured him. As soon as I was able to walk, which was in March of 1968, Dave was moved out. Okay. I remained in solitary confinement from the time on for more than 2 years. I was not allowed to see or talk to or communicate with any of my fellow prisoners. My room was fairly decent size. I say it was about 10 by 10. The door was solid. There were no windows. The only ventilation came from 2 small holes at the top of the ceiling, about 6 inches from about 4 inches. Roof was tin, and it got hot as hell in there. The room was kind of dim in night and day, but they always kept on a small light bulb so they could observe me. I was in that place for 2 years. Communication was vital for survival. As far as this business of solitary confinement goes, The most important thing for survival is communication with someone. Even if it's only a wave or a wink, a tap on the wall, or to have a guy put his thumb up. It makes all the difference. Next. It's vital to keep your mind occupied, and we all worked on that. Some guys were interested in mathematics, so they would work out complex formulas in their head. We were never allowed to have writing materials. Others would build a whole house from basement on up. I have more of a philosophical bent. I read a lot of history. I spent days on end going back over those history books in my mind, figuring out where this country or that country went wrong, what the United States should do in the area of foreign affairs. I thought a lot about the meaning of life. It was easy to lapse into fantasies. I used to write books and plays in my mind, but I doubt that any of them would have been above the level of cheapest dime novel. People have asked me how we could remember detailed things like the tap code, numbers, names, and all sorts of things. The fact is, when you don't have anything else to think about, no outside distractions, it's easy. Next. Since I've been back, it's very hard for me to remember simple things, the name of someone I've just met. During one period which I was in solitary, I memorized the names of all 335 men who were then prisoners of war in North Vietnam. I can still remember them. One thing you have to fight is worry. It's easy to get uptight about your physical condition. One time I had a hell of a hemorrhoid and I stewed about it for about 3 days. Finally I said, look, McCain, you're never known of a single guy who died of a hemorrhoid. So I just ignored it as best I could. After a few months, it went away. Okay. The story of Ernie Brace illustrates how vital communications was to us. While I was in a prison we called the Plantation in October of 1968, there was a room behind me. I heard some noises in there, so I started tapping on the wall. Our call sign was the old shave and a haircut, and then the other guy would come back with 2 taps, 6 bits. For 2 weeks, I got no answers, but finally came the 2 taps. I started tapping out the alphabet, 1 tap for A, 2 for B, and so on. Then I said, put your ear to the wall. By putting my cup against it, I could talk through it and make him hear me. I gave him the tap code and other information. He gave me his name, Ernie Brace. About that time, the guard came in and round, and I told Ernie, okay, I'll call you tomorrow. Okay, next. It took me several days to get back to him up on the wall again. When I finally did, he could say, well, all he could say was, I'm Ernie Brace. And then he started sobbing. After about 2 days, he was able to control his emotions, and within a week, this guy was tapping and communicating and dropping notes. From then on, we did a truly outstanding job. Erwin's civilian pilot who was shot down over Laos had just come from 3.5 years living in a bamboo cage in the jungle with his feet in stocks, an iron collar around his neck with a rope tied to it. He had nearly lost use of his legs. He escaped 3 times, and after the 3rd, he was buried into the ground up to his neck. And that's a picture of Ernie Brace. He was captured in May of 21st, 68. In those days, still in 1968, we were allowed to bathe every other day, supposedly. But in this camp, they had a water problem, and sometimes we'd go for 2 or 3 weeks, a month, without a bath. I had a real rat for turnkey who usually would take me out at last. The bath was a sort of a stall-like affair that had a concrete tub. After everyone else had bathed, there was usually no water left. So I'd stand there for my allotted 5 minutes and he'd take me back to my room. For toilet facilities, I had a bucket with a lid that didn't fit. It was emptied daily. They'd have someone else carry it because I walked so badly. Okay. From that time, Overley and Day left me. Overley left in February of 1968. Day left in March. Overley came home. Day was assigned to a new prison. My treatment was basically good. I would get caught communicating, talking to guys through the wall, tapping, that kind of stuff, and they just say, tis, 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 no, no, no. Really, I thought things weren't too bad. Then on about June 15th, 1968, I was taken up one night to the interrogation room. The cat, another man that was called the rabbit, were there. The rabbit spoke very good English. Remember, these are the names that they gave their prison guards. The cat was the commander of all the camps at that time. He was making believe he didn't speak English, although it was obvious to me after some conversation that he did, because he was asking questions or talking before the rabbit translated what I had said. Next. The Oriental, as you may know, likes to beat around up the bush quite a bit. The first night we sat there and the cat talked to me for about 2 hours. I didn't know what he was driving at. He told me that he had run the French POW camps in the early 1950s, and that he had released a couple of guys and that he had seen them just recently and they had thanked him for his kindness. He said that Obley had gone home with honor. They told me I'd never go home. I really didn't know what to think because I had been having these other interrogators in which I had refused to cooperate. It was not hard because they were torturing me at the time. They just told me I'd never go home and I was going to be tried as a war criminal. That was their constant theme for many months. Okay. Suddenly the cat said to me, "Do you want to go home?" I was astonished and tell you frankly that I said that I would have to think about it, and I went back to my room and thought about it for a long time. At this time, I did not have any communications with the camp senior ranking officer, so I could not get any advice. I was worried whether I could stay alive or not because I was in rather bad condition. I had been hit with a severe case of dysentery, which kept on for about a year and a half. I was losing weight again. Okay, next. But I knew the code of conduct says you will not accept parole or amnesty and that you will not accept special favors. For somebody to go home early is a special favor. There's no other way you can cut it. I went back to him 3 nights later. He asked me again, "Do you want to go home?" I told him no. He wanted to know why, and I told him the reason I said that Alvarez, who at the time everybody thought was the first American captured, should go first, as the code of conduct states. Then enlisted men and that kind of stuff. The cat told me that President Lyndon Johnson had ordered me home. He handed me a letter from my wife in which she had said, "I wish that you had been one of those 3 who got to come home." Of course, she had no way to understand the ramifications of this. Next. The cat said that doctors had told him that I could not live unless I got medical treatment in the United States. Went through this routine and still I told him no. 3 nights later, we went through it all over again. On the morning of 4th of July, 1968, which happened to be the same day that my father took over as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Forces in the Pacific, I was led into another room, quiz room. The rabbit and the cat were sitting there. I walked in and sat down. The rabbit said, "Our senior wants to know your final answer." Next. My final answer is the same. It's no. That is your final answer? That is my final answer. With this, the cat, who was sitting there with a pile of papers in front of him and a pen in his hand, broke the pen in 2. Ink spurted all over. He stood up, kicked the chair over behind him and said, "They taught you too well. They taught you too well in perfect English, I might add." He turned, went out, and slammed the door, leaving the rabbit and me sitting there. The rabbit said, "Now, McCain, it would be very bad for you. Go back to your room." Next. What they wanted, of course, was send me home with the same time that my father took over as commander in the Pacific. This would have made them look very humane in releasing the injured son of a top U.S. officer. It would also have given them a great lever against my fellow prisoners because the North Vietnamese were always putting this class business on us. They could have said to the others, "Look, you poor devils, the son of a man who is running the war has gone home and left you here. No one cares about you ordinary fellows. I was determined at all times to prevent any exploitation of my family and my father and my family. There was another consideration for me. Even though I was told I would not have to sign any statements or confessions before I went home, I didn't believe them. They would have got me to write up to that airplane and said, now, just sign this little statement. At that point, I doubt that I could have resisted, even though I felt very strong at the time. Next. But the primary thing I considered was that I had no right to go ahead of men like Alvarez, and that's a picture of Alvarez, who had been there 3 years before I got killed. That's what we say instead of before I got shot down, because in a way, becoming a prisoner in North Vietnam was like being killed. About a month and a half later, when the 3 men who were selected for release had reached America, I was set up for some very severe treatment, which lasted for the next year and a half. One night, the guards came into my room and said, the camp commander wants to see you. This man was a particular idiotic individual. We call him Slopehead. Next. One thing I should mention here, the camps were set up very similar to their army. They had a camp commander who was a military man, basically in charge of the maintenance of the camp, the food, and so forth. Then they had what they call a staff officer, actually a political officer, who was in charge of the interrogation and provided the propaganda you heard on the radio. We also had a guy in our camp whom we named the South Slope Ferry. He was from an important family in North Vietnam. He wore a fancy uniform and was a real sharp cookie with a dominant position in this camp. The South Slope Ferry, who was somewhat effeminate, was the nice guy, and the camp commander, Slopehead, was the bad guy. Old South Slope would always come in whenever anything went wrong and say, oh, I didn't know this did this to you. All you had to do was cooperate and everything would have been okay. Next. They wanted a statement saying that I was sorry for the crimes that I had committed against North Vietnamese people and that I was grateful for the treatment that I had received from them. This was a paradox. So many guys were mistreated to get them to say when they were grateful. Well, this is the communist way. This was a paradox. So many guys were so mistreated to get them to say they were grateful. Again, but this is the communist way. I held out for 4 days. Finally, I reached the lowest point of my 5.5 years in North Vietnam. I was at the point of suicide because I saw that I was reaching the end of my rope. Next. I said, okay, I'll write for them. They took me up into one of the interrogation rooms, and for the next 12 hours, we wrote and rewrote. The North Vietnamese interrogators, who was pretty stupid, wrote the final confession and I signed it. It was in their language and spoke about black crimes and other generalities. It was unacceptable to them, but I felt just terrible about it. I kept saying to myself, oh God, I really didn't have any choice. I had learned what was all learned over there. Every man has his breaking point. I had reached mine. And you can see the newspapers, tape has McCain's son praising his red doctors. So it was used for propaganda. Then the Gooks made a very serious mistake because they had let me go back and rest for a couple of weeks. They usually didn't do that with guys when they had them really busted. I think it concerned them that my arm was broken and they had messed up my leg. I had been reduced to an animal during this period of beating and torture. My arm was so painful I couldn't get up off the floor. With the dysentery, it was a very unpleasant time. Thank God they let me rest for a couple of weeks. Then they called me up and again wanted something else. I don't remember what it was now. It was some kind of statement. This time I was able to resist. I was able to carry on. They couldn't bust me again. Okay. Prayer. I was sustained in times of trial. I was finding that prayer helped. It wasn't a question of asking for superhuman strength or for God to strike the North Vietnamese dead. It was asking for moral and physical courage, for guidance and wisdom to do the right thing. I asked for comfort when I was in pain, and sometimes I received relief. I was sustained in many times of trial. When the pressure was on, you seemed to go one way or the other. Either it was easier for them to break you for the next time, or it was harder In other words, if you're going to make it, you've got tougher, or as time goes by, part of it's just transition from our way of life to that way of life. But you get to hate them so bad that it gives you strength. Okay? But I was never going to stop. Communicating with your fellow prisoners was the utmost values. The difference between being able to resist and not being able to resist, you may get some argument from other prisoners on that. A lot depends on the individual. Some men are much more self-sufficient than others. Communications primarily serve to keep up morale. Would risk getting beat up just to tell a man that one of his friends had gotten a letter from home. But it was also valuable to establish a chain of command in our camps, so our senior officers would give us advice and guidance. Next. So this is a period of repeated severe treatment. It lasted until October of '69. They wanted to see me to see delegations. There were anti-war groups coming in Hanoi, a lot of foreigners, Cubans, Russians. I don't think we had too many American peaceniks that early, although with the next year it got much greater. I refused to see any of them. The propaganda value to them would have been too great with my dad as commander in the Pacific. As you can see there, they've got that prisoner hung upside down. The big picture, they've got a prisoner hanging up. His arms were tied behind him, and they're hanging him from a pulley where his arms behind him, and they're beating him with a bamboo stick. That'll kind of give you an idea of some of the torture. Dave Jellinger came over. Tom Hayden came over. 3 groups of released prisoners, in fact, were let out in custody of the peace groups. The first ones released went home with one of the Beringer brothers. The next group was the whole crew. One of them was James Johnson, one of them Fort Hood 3. The wife, the Ramparts magazine editor, and Rennie Davis were along. Although altogether, I think about 8 of them, well, 9 of them were in that outfit. Then the third group followed. The North Vietnamese wanted me to meet with all of them, but I was able to avoid them. And a lot of times you couldn't face them down, so you had to try to get around them. Face is a big thing with these people, you know, and if you get around them so that they could save face, then it was a lot easier. Next. This is kind of give you an idea who some of those people were. David T. Jellinger was an influential American radical pacifist and activist for nonviolent social change. He achieved peak notoriety as one of the Chicago 7 who were put on trial in 1968. You might want to do some research on Chicago 7. During World War II, he was an imprisoned conscious objector and anti-war agitator. In February 1946, Jellinger helped to found the Radical Pacifist Committee for Nonviolent Revolution. He sat on the executive committee of the Socialist Party of America and the Young People's Socialist League, its youth section, until he left in 1943, and he was also a longtime member of the World Resistance League. That's who David Jellinger was. The next one, Thomas Emmett Hayden was an American social and political activist, author, and politician. Hayden was best known for his major role as an anti-war civil rights and radical intellectual activist in the 1960s, authoring the Port Huron Statement and standing trial in the Chicago 7 case. In later years, he ran for political office numerous times, winning seats in both the California Assembly and California Senate. At the end of his life, he was the director of the Peace and Justice Resource Center in Los Angeles. He was also married to Jane Fonda for 17 years. Next slide. Daniel and Philip Barrington. The Barrington brothers, Daniel, a Jesuit priest, and Philip of the Josephite order, led the anti-war and anti-draft movements during the Vietnam War. Philip served in the U.S. Army in World War II, becoming a priest in 1955. Daniel, the intellectual and theologian, ordained in 1952. The Barrington brothers' radical anti-war activism inflected increased alienation from the government and American society. Okay. Next. The Fort Hood 3. They were the 3 soldiers of the United States Army, PFC James Johnson, Jr., Private David A. Samus, and Private Dennis Moore, who refused to be deployed to Vietnam in July of 1966. This is the first public refusal of orders to Vietnam and one of the earliest acts of resistance to the war from within the U.S. military. Their refusal was widely publicized and became a cause celebre within the growing anti-war movement. They filed a federal suit against Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara and Secretary of the Army Stanley Resler to prevent their shipments to Southeast Asia and were court-martialed by the Army for insubordination. And that's their story. Renee Cordon Rennie is best known as an American anti-war activist in the 1960s. He was one of the Chicago 7 defendants charged for anti-war demonstrations and large-scale protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. He had a prominent organizational role in the American anti-Vietnam War protest movement of the 1960s. In early 1970s, Davis became a follower of Guru Maharaja Prem Rawat in his Divine Light mission. He began to travel as a spiritual lecturer. He also became a venture capitalist and founded the Foundation for a New Humanity to combine these goals. That's who he was. So next. And then the wife of the Ramparts magazine was there. But if you notice in the middle there, that is a thing from the FBI authorizing the renewal discreetly of a one-year subscription to the Ramparts. The FBI used the Ramparts magazine to keep up what was going on and so forth. Originally it was called the Catholic Independent Journal. Next slide, please. Now, going back to those men we just talked about, you wonder how they got there. 3 soldiers who didn't want to go to Vietnam ended up going to Vietnam. But here's this radical group going over there, and seemed to nobody in the government didn't seem to do anything about it. For example, they would beat the hell out of me and say I was going to see a delegation. I responded that, okay, I'd see a delegation, but I would not say anything against my country, and I would not say anything about my treatment. And if asked, I'd tell them the truth about the conditions I was kept under. This is going back now to what McCain had to say when they wanted him to meet these people. They went back and conferred on that and then would say, you have agreed to see a delegation, so we will take you. But they never took me, you see. One time they wanted me to write a message to my fellow prisoners at Christmas. I wrote down, to my friends in the camp who have not been allowed to see or speak to, I hope that your families are well and happy, and I hope that you will be able to write and receive letters in accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1949, which has not been allowed to you by our captors, and may God bless you. Okay. Next slide. They took it out. They took it, but of course, it was never published. In other words, something was better to write something than it was a little laudatory to your government or against them to say, I won't write it all. Because a lot of times they had to go up through channels, and sometimes you could buy a time this way. How Dick Stratton was really wrung out. At this point, I want to tell you the story of Captain Dick Stratton. He was shot down in May of 1967 when the American peace groups were claiming that the United States was bombing Hanoi. We were not at the time. Dick was shot down well outside of Hanoi, but they wanted a confession at the time. An American reporter was over there. That was in the spring and summer of '67. Remember those stories that came back, very sensational stories about the American bomb damage? Next one. The Rabbit and others worked on Dick Stratton very hard. He's got huge rope scars on his arms where they were infected. They really wrung him out because they were going to get a confession that he had bombed Hanoi. This was to be a living proof. He also peeled his thumbnails back and burned him with cigarettes. That is him there in the picture. Dick reached a point where he couldn't say no. But when they got him to the press conference, he pulled this bowing act on them. He bowed 90 degrees in this direction and bowed 90 degrees in that direction, 4 quadrants. This was not too wild to the gooks because they're used to the bowing thing. One more. Next. You can see him there bowing. But any American who sees a picture of another American bowing to the waist every turn for 90 degrees knows there's something wrong. with the guy. There's something has happened to him. That's why Dick did what he did. After that, they continued to keep pressure on him to say he wasn't tortured. They tortured him to say things he wasn't tortured. It gets to be a bad merry-go-round to be on. Dick made some very strong statements at his press conference here in the States a few weeks ago. He said he wanted the North Vietnamese charged with his war crimes. He's a fine man. He and I were at the plantation together for a long time, and he did a very fine job there. He's an outstanding naval officer and a very dedicated American religious man. Now, I'm going to stop it there because we're getting short, we are out of time. But we will go back to the continue on with McCain's story that he has written himself for our next show, which our next show is June 24th. So we will go back in and go over what John McCain has had to say when he was writing his own story, and then we'll go on from there. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's show as we search and come to your own conclusion. Just whether John McCain was a POW hero or he was actually a traitor. Right now, things sound pretty good looking at it, but you'll have to come up with your own decision. So hope you stay safe. Look out for the virus and so forth out there. Do what you got to do with your family. Be comfortable, and we'll see you next show. Thank you very much. Good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.